I found her stealing bread again, but the sheriff sat her down and said, "You work here now," the third time. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a town that had seen better days when the railroad still ran through it. The wooden buildings creaked under the relentless heat, their paint peeling like old scabs. Sheriff Thomas Kane wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he made his rounds, his boots echoing against the worn planks of the boardwalk. At 42, Kane had seen enough trouble to last 3 lifetimes. His graying hair and the deep lines around his eyes told stories of countless confrontations, sleepless nights, and the weight of keeping order in a place where hope seemed as scarce as rain. Sheriff Kane!" The voice belonged to Martha Henley, the storekeeper's wife. Her face flushed red with indignation as she hurried toward him, her heavy skirts kicking up dust clouds with each step. "It's that girl again," Martha panted, pressing a hand to her chest. "The wild one. We caught her behind the store stealing bread. Again." Kane's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who she meant. The girl couldn't be more than 16, though the streets had aged her beyond her years, had been making rounds through town for weeks now. Small, quick as a desert fox, with tangled dark hair and clothes that looked like they'd been borrowed from scarecrows. "Where is she now?" Kane asked, his voice steady despite the familiar weight settling in his chest. "Hollis has her cornered behind the general store. Says this is the 3rd time, Sheriff." "The 3rd time. People are starting to talk. They say you're being too soft, letting her run wild like some kind of—" "I'll handle it," Kane interrupted, tipping his hat. "Thank you, Mrs. Henley." As he walked toward the general store, Kane could feel the eyes of the townspeople following him. Mrs. Patterson peered through her lace curtains. Old Pete spat into the dust and shook his head. Even the children stopped their games to watch. Behind the store he found exactly what he expected. A small crowd had gathered around Hollis Henley, a burly man with arms like tree trunks who stood blocking the narrow alley. And there, pressed against the weathered wood wall like a cornered animal, was the girl. Her name was Elena Vasquez, though Kane had only learned that from the wanted posters that occasionally drifted through town. No family anyone knew of, no home to speak of, just a ghost who appeared and disappeared like morning mist, always hungry, always running. "There she is, Sheriff," Hollis announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd finally cornered his prey. "Caught her red-handed with my bread. Stale bread, mind you, but that ain't the point." Elena's dark eyes darted between the faces surrounding her, calculating distances, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Her small hands clutched the heel of bread against her chest like it was made of gold. "She's wild, Sheriff," called out Mrs. Patterson, who'd somehow materialized from behind her curtains. "Wild as a coyote. Needs to be taught a lesson before she starts taking more than bread." Kane studied the girl's face. Thin, sharp cheekbones that spoke of too many missed meals. But it was her eyes that caught him. They weren't defiant or cruel. They were desperate, tired. The eyes of someone who'd been fighting just to survive for far too long. "How long since you've eaten?" Kane asked quietly, stepping closer. The question seemed to catch Elena off guard. She'd been prepared for accusations, for rough hands and harsh words, not quiet concern. "Don't matter," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I ain't looking for pity. I'm not offering pity," Kane replied. "I'm asking a question." The crowd murmured behind him. This wasn't how these things usually went. Usually there'd be shouting, maybe some rope talk, certainly a night in the cell to teach her a lesson. 2 days, Elena admitted finally, her chin lifting in a small act of defiance. "Maybe 3. Time gets fuzzy when you're hungry." Kane nodded slowly, then turned to face the crowd. "I'll handle this. You all can go back to your business now." "But Sheriff," Hollis protested, "what about the bread? What about making an example?" Kane's eyes hardened. "I said I'll handle it." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, with backward glances and whispered conversations. Soon, only Kane and Elena remained in the alley, the afternoon sun casting long shadows between the buildings. "You're not going to arrest me?" Elena asked, suspicion clear in her voice. "Should I?" Kane countered, leaning against the opposite wall. "You took bread to feed yourself. Seems like the natural thing to do when you're starving." Elena's grip on the bread loosened slightly. "Most folks don't see it that way. Most folks have never been hungry enough to steal," Kane said. "I have." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "You have?" Kane nodded. "Long time ago, before I wore this badge, before I had a purpose." He paused, studying her carefully. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "About what?" "About being hungry, about having to steal, about running from shadow to shadow like you're already dead." Elena's shoulders sagged slightly. "What choice do I have? This is all I know." Kane pushed off from the wall and walked slowly toward her. Elena tensed, ready to bolt, but something in his manner kept her still. "There's always a choice," he said softly. Might not be the choice you want, but there's always one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, holding it out to her. This is for the bread. Payment, not charity. Elena stared at the coin like it might bite her. Why? Because work deserves payment, Kane said simply, and because I'm about to offer you a job. The words hung in the air between them. Elena's eyes widened, and for a moment Kane saw not the hardened street survivor, but the 16-year-old girl she really was. A job? She whispered. Kane nodded. My office needs cleaning. Papers need filing. Coffee needs making. It's not much, but it's honest work, and it comes with a roof over your head and 3 meals a day. Why? Elena asked again, but this time the word carried a different weight. Not suspicion, but wonder. Kane was quiet for a long moment, looking at this girl who reminded him of himself at that age. Lost, hungry, convinced the world had no place for him. Because everyone deserves a chance, he said finally, and because I think you might be more than what people see when they look at you. Elena took the coin with trembling fingers. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough? Then we'll figure it out, Kane said. Together, as they walked back toward the sheriff's office, Elena clutching the bread and the coin, Kane felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for the girl walking beside him, but for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference in this dusty, forgotten town. Behind them, curtains twitched and voices whispered, but Kane didn't care. He'd made his choice, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the right one. The first day, the sheriff's office stood at the end of Main Street like a weathered sentinel, its adobe walls scarred by decades of desert storms and bullet holes from less civilized times. Elena followed Kane through the heavy wooden door, her stomach nodding with each step. The interior was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the relentless Texas heat. Home sweet home, Kane said, gesturing around the sparse room. The office was larger than Elena had expected, divided into 3 main areas. A front section with a desk, 2 chairs and filing cabinets that looked like they'd seen better days. A middle area with a gun rack and a pot-bellied stove. And at the back, 2 jail cells separated by iron bars that had been painted and repainted so many times they looked like they were wearing armor. It ain't much to look at, Kane continued, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, but it served its purpose for near on 20 years. Elena stood in the doorway, still clutching the bread and coin. The reality of what she'd agreed to was starting to sink in. She'd never held a job before, never stayed in one place long enough to learn the rhythms of regular work. What exactly would I be doing? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane walked to his desk, which was buried under a mountain of papers, reports, and correspondence. Well, as you can see, I'm not much for organization. Papers need sorting, filing, keeping track of. The coffee pot needs cleaning. I swear it's growing things that weren't meant to exist. And the cells back there need sweeping out regular, along with the rest of the office. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small brass key. There's a room upstairs. Used to be storage, but it's got a window, a bed, and a washstand. Nothing fancy, but it's yours if you want it. Elena stared at the key like it was a foreign object. I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Kane settled into his chair, which creaked under his weight. Let me tell you something about this town, Elena. Redemption Creek is dying. Has been for years. The young folks leave as soon as they can, heading for Dallas or Houston or anywhere that promises more than dust and memories. The ones who stay. He gestured toward the window where the main street stretched out empty in the afternoon heat. They've given up hoping for anything better. But what's that got to do with me? Maybe nothing, Kane admitted. Or maybe everything. See, I've been wearing this badge for 15 years and I've seen a lot of people pass through. Most of them were just passing through. Here today, gone tomorrow. But every once in a while someone comes along who might just stick around if given the chance. Elena shifted uncomfortably. You don't know me. I could be a killer, a thief, or worse. Kane's weathered face cracked into a small smile. Could be, but I've got a feeling you're not. Call it lawman's instinct or just an old man's hope, but I think you're exactly what this place needs. What's that? Someone who's still willing to fight. Before Elena could respond, the door burst open, and a man in his 30s strode in. He was tall, well-dressed in the manner of successful merchants, with perfectly groomed hair, and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about where his next meal would come from. Sheriff Kane, the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm James Morrison, president of the Merchants Association. I believe we need to talk. Kane leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. Mr. Morrison, what brings you by? Morrison's eyes flicked to Elena, taking in her ragged appearance with obvious distaste. I think you know why I'm here. The whole town's talking about your charitable act this afternoon. Is that what they're calling it? They're calling it a lot of things, Sheriff, most of them not very flattering. Morrison moved closer to the desk, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. Look, I understand you feel sorry for the girl. We all do. But hiring her? Giving her a position of trust? That's a mistake. Why's that? Kane asked mildly. Because she's a thief. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. She's been stealing from us for weeks. You can't just reward that behavior and expect— She was hungry, Kane interrupted. She took bread to eat. That's not the same as stealing for profit or malice. Morrison's face reddened. Theft is theft, Sheriff, and now you're telling the whole town that crime pays. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends? Elena found herself stepping forward, her own anger flaring. I never asked for your charity, mister, and I sure as hell don't need your approval. Morrison turned to her, his lip curling. You should be grateful the sheriff's taken pity on you, girl, but don't think for a moment that the rest of us are going to stand for. Mr. Morrison. Kane's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stood slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. I appreciate your concern, but my hiring decisions aren't subject to committee approval. The town council might disagree with that assessment, Morrison said, his tone turning threatening. Sheriff positions are elected, after all. The room fell silent. Elena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of the moment settling around them like dust after a storm. Kane studied Morrison for a long moment, then smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that transformed his weathered features. Is that a threat, Mr. Morrison? Morrison's confident facade cracked. I'm simply pointing out political realities, Sheriff. The people of this town have certain expectations. The people of this town elected me to keep the peace and uphold the law, Kane said, his voice deadly quiet. That's what I intend to do. If you or anyone else has a problem with how I run my office, you're welcome to file a complaint with the territorial authorities. Morrison's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. This isn't over, Sheriff. The girl is trouble, and mark my words, she'll prove it before this is done. He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Elena stood frozen, her earlier confidence evaporating. Maybe he's right, she whispered. Maybe I am trouble. Kane walked around the desk and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Elena, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. The James Morrisons of the world are always afraid of change, because change threatens their comfortable little kingdoms. They'd rather keep things exactly as they are, even if it means good people suffer. But what if I let you down? What if I can't do this? Kane's hand squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, I need to know. Are you willing to try? Elena looked around the office, at the mountains of paperwork, the dusty floors, the coffee pot that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in months. It was overwhelming, but it was also something she'd never had before. A chance. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I'm willing to try. Kane smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. Good, then let's get started. First thing we need to do is get you some proper clothes. Can't have my deputy running around in rags. Deputy? Elena's eyes widened. Well, you'll need an official title. Deputy sounds about right, don't you think? For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. It was fragile, like a small flame in a strong wind, but it was there. Deputy Elena Vasquez, she said, testing the words. I like the sound of that. Kane chuckled. So do I. Now let's see about getting you that room upstairs and some decent clothes. Tomorrow we'll start teaching you the real work. As they climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, Elena felt the weight of the coin in her pocket, her first honest payment for honest work. It was just a silver dollar, but it represented something much more valuable, a chance to be more than what everyone expected her to be. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Through the upstairs window, Elena could see the main street of Redemption Creek, empty and dusty as always. But for the first time, it didn't look like a place to escape from. It looked like home, finding her place. 3 weeks into her new life, Elena had fallen into a routine that felt both foreign and comforting. She woke before dawn, made coffee that Kane claimed was the best he'd tasted in years, and spent the morning organizing the chaos that passed for his filing system. The work was simple but satisfying. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. The clothes Kane had bought her, 2 simple dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun, had transformed her from a street waif into something resembling a respectable young woman. But it was the badge Kane had given her, a small silver star that read Deputy, that truly changed how she saw herself. This morning was different, though. Elena sensed it the moment she stepped into the office. Kane sat at his desk, staring at a telegram with the expression of a man who'd just been told his house was on fire. Bad news? Elena asked, setting down his coffee cup. Kane looked up, his weathered face grave. The Hartwell gang hit the bank in Millerville yesterday, killed 2 people, including a woman and her child. Elena's blood ran cold. She'd heard stories about the Hartwell gang, a group of ruthless outlaws who'd been terrorizing small towns across Texas for months. led by a man named Dutch Hartwell. They were known for their brutality and their ability to disappear into the desert like ghosts. "Are they heading this way?" Elena asked. "Most likely," Kane said, folding the telegram. "They usually move south after a job and we're right in their path. The territorial marshal's office is sending deputies, but they won't be here for at least 3 days." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What do we do?" Kane stood and walked to the gun rack, selecting a Winchester rifle and checking its action. "We get ready, and we pray they decide to pass us by." But even as he said it, Elena could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it would be that simple. The door opened, and Dr. William Hayes entered, his medical bag in hand, and his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Hayes was one of the few people in town who'd supported Kane's decision to hire Elena, and over the past weeks, he'd become something of a friend. "Sheriff," he said, nodding to Elena. "Deputy, I suppose you've heard about Millerville?" "Just got word," Kane replied. "What's the talk around town?" Hayes sighed heavily. "Morrison's been holding court at the saloon since yesterday evening. He's got half the town convinced that this is all your fault somehow. Says if you'd been focused on real law enforcement instead of playing nursemaid to strays, maybe the gang wouldn't be heading our way." Elena felt her cheeks burn. "That's not fair. Sheriff Kane's done nothing but—" "I know what he's done," Hayes interrupted gently, "and so do the reasonable people in this town. But fear makes people look for someone to blame, and you've become Morrison's convenient target." Kane strapped on his gun belt, his movements deliberate and practiced. "Let them talk. Right now I need to focus on keeping this town safe." "What can I do to help?" Elena asked. Both men turned to look at her, and Elena saw something in their expressions that made her heart sink. Pity, protection, the assumption that she was too fragile, too inexperienced to be of real use. "Elena," Kane said carefully, "I think it would be best if you—" "No," Elena said firmly. "Don't you dare try to ship me off somewhere safe. I'm your deputy. This is my job too." "You've been here 3 weeks," Kane said. "You've never faced anything like this." "Neither have you," Elena shot back. "Not in this town. Not with these people depending on you." Hayes cleared his throat. "If I may, Elena's right. She knows this town now, knows the people. And frankly, Sheriff, you're going to need all the help you can get." Kane studied Elena's face for a long moment, seeing the determination there, the refusal to be cast aside just when things got difficult. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but you follow my orders no matter what." "Understood." "Understood," Elena said, relief flooding through her. The rest of the morning was spent in preparation. Kane sent word to the surrounding ranches, warning them of the approaching danger. Elena helped him check and clean weapons, ensuring they had adequate ammunition. They reviewed the town's layout, identifying defensive positions and escape routes. It was during this preparation that Elena first truly understood what Kane had meant about fighting for something. She wasn't just defending a job or a place to sleep. She was defending the first home she'd ever known, the first person who'd ever believed in her. Around noon, a dusty rider approached the office. Elena recognized him as Tom Bradley, a young rancher from outside town who'd always been kind to her during her brief trips to the general store. "Sheriff," Tom said, dismounting quickly, "I rode in as soon as I got your message. The boys and we're ready to help however we can." "I appreciate that, Tom," Kane said, shaking his hand. "But I won't ask civilians to risk their lives. This is my responsibility." "With respect, Sheriff, this is our town too. We've all got something to lose if those men come here." Within an hour, a dozen men had gathered in the office. Ranchers, shopkeepers, even old Pete from the livery stable. Not soldiers, but men who'd decided that running wasn't an option. Morrison arrived as the impromptu meeting was breaking up. His face was flushed, his expensive suit wrinkled, and Elena could smell whiskey on his breath even from across the room. "This is madness," he announced, swaying slightly. "You're going to get us all killed, Kane, and for what? This nobody town isn't worth dying for." "Then leave," Kane said simply. "Take your family and go. No one's stopping you." Morrison's face darkened. "You think you're so noble, don't you? You and your little pet thief, but when the shooting starts, she'll run. Mark my words, she'll run just like she always has." Elena felt every eye in the room turn to her. The weight of their expectations, their doubts, their fears pressed down on her like a physical thing. For a moment she felt the familiar urge to flee, to disappear into the desert and let someone else deal with the consequences. But then she looked at Kane, saw the quiet confidence in his eyes, and remembered what he'd told her that first day. "Everyone deserves a chance." "You're right about one thing, Mr. Morrison," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have run before. I ran from hunger, from cold, from people who wanted to hurt me. But I'm not running anymore. This is my home now, and I'll fight for it." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Tom Bradley stepped forward and placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Good enough for me," he said simply. One by one, the other men nodded their agreement. Even Morrison seemed taken aback by the quiet resolve in Elena's voice. As the meeting dispersed, Kane walked Elena to the window overlooking Main Street. The sun was setting, painting the dusty road in shades of gold and crimson. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Elena thought about the girl who'd been stealing bread just 3 weeks ago, desperate and alone. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, the woman who wore a badge and had people willing to stand beside her. "I'm sure," she said. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Kane smiled, and Elena saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Pride, not just in what she'd become but in what she'd chosen to be. "Together," he agreed. As if summoned by their words, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Even from this distance, Elena could see the dark shapes of riders moving toward town. The Hartwell gang was coming, but for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid. She had something worth fighting for and people willing to fight beside her. Whatever happened next, she would face it as Deputy Elena Vasquez, not as a frightened girl running from shadows. The real test was about to begin. The storm arrives. The Hartwell gang rode into Redemption Creek just as the sun touched the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the burning sky. Elena counted 8 riders, all armed, all carrying themselves with the lazy confidence of men who'd never met serious resistance. At their head rode Dutch Hartwell himself, a tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. Elena crouched behind an overturned wagon alongside Kane, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rifle in her hands felt both familiar and foreign. She'd learned to shoot during her weeks on the street, but target practice was different from this. This was real. This was life and death. "Remember," Kane whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "We're not trying to be heroes. We're trying to survive long enough for help to arrive." The gang stopped in the middle of Main Street, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. Dutch Hartwell surveyed the seemingly empty town with the practiced eye of a predator. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Looks like word of our arrival preceded us. That's disappointing. I do so enjoy a warm welcome." One of his men, a heavy-set rider with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, spat into the dust. "Looks like they all ran, Dutch. Cowards." Now, Scarface," Dutch said, his tone almost conversational. "Let's not be hasty. I'm sure there are still some good folks about. People with money, people with information." He raised his voice. "Come now, friends. We're just passing through. No need to hide like rabbits." Elena felt Kane tense beside her. She followed his gaze and saw what he'd spotted. Movement in the window of the general store. Mrs. Henley's face, pale and frightened, peering through the glass. Dutch saw it too. His smile was like a knife blade. There we are. Billy, why don't you and Jackson go invite the nice lady to join us for a chat?" 2 of the gang members dismounted and started toward the store. Elena saw Kane's hand tighten on his rifle, saw the muscle in his jaw clench. She knew he was calculating distances, angles, chances of success. "Sheriff," she whispered, "we can't let them." "I know," Kane said, "but if we move now, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. We need to wait for the right moment." The right moment came sooner than expected. As Billy and Jackson approached the store, Tom Bradley stepped out from behind the blacksmith's shop, his rifle trained on the nearest rider. "That's far enough," Tom called out. "Turn around and ride out of here and nobody gets hurt." Dutch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Well, I'll be damned. One brave soul after all." He drew his pistol with fluid grace. "I admire courage, son. Pity it's so often fatal." The gunshot echoed off the buildings like thunder. Tom Bradley crumpled to the dust, clutching his shoulder, but his sacrifice had given Kane the distraction he needed. "Now!" Kane shouted, rising from behind the wagon. The carefully planned ambush unfolded in a chaos of gunfire and shouting. Kane's first shot took down the rider nearest to Dutch. Elena, her hands steadier than she dared hope, put a bullet into the chest of the man called Scarface. All along Main Street, the townspeople opened fire from their hiding places, but the gang was experienced and they recovered quickly. Dutch wheeled his horse around, returning fire with deadly accuracy. One of the ranchers cried out and fell from his position on the hotel roof. "Elena!" Kane shouted over the gunfire. "The alley! They're trying to flank us!" Elena saw them, 2 gang members spurring their horses toward the narrow passage between the general store and the bank. If they reached it, they'd be behind the defenders' positions. Without thinking, Elena broke cover and ran toward the alley, her boots pounding on the packed earth. She reached the mouth of the passage just as the first rider rounded the corner. Her rifle barked, and the man tumbled from his saddle. The second rider was faster, his pistol already in his hand. Elena dove to the side as his bullet chipped splinters from the wall where her head had been. She rolled, came up on one knee, and fired again. This time her aim was true, but the sound of gunfire was changing. The steady volleys from the townspeople were becoming more sporadic. more desperate. Elena risked a look back at Main Street and saw that the gang was adapting, using their superior mobility to pick off the stationary defenders. "We need to move," Kane shouted, reloading his rifle. "They're whittling us down." Elena ran back to his position, her mind racing. They needed something to change the dynamic, something to give them an advantage. Then she remembered the old mine shaft behind the hotel, a tunnel that led to the other side of town. "Kane," she called out. "The mine tunnel. We can get behind them." Kane's eyes lit up with understanding. "Can you get to it without being seen?" "I think so, but I'll need cover." Kane nodded grimly. "Tom," he called to the wounded rancher, who was still conscious and still fighting. "On my signal, everyone concentrate fire on Dutch. Give Elena a clear path." Tom raised his rifle with his good arm and nodded. "Now!" Kane shouted. The combined fire from the remaining defenders forced Dutch and his men to take cover. Elena sprinted across the street, her heart pounding, Dutch's return fire kicking up dust at her heels. She reached the hotel and slipped around back, finding the old mine entrance just where she remembered it. The tunnel was dark and narrow, carved from the living rock decades ago when men still believed there was gold in these hills. Elena moved through it by feel, her rifle held ready, trying to ignore the way the walls seemed to press in around her. She emerged behind the abandoned church, directly behind the gang's position. From here she could see everything. Dutch rallying his men, the townspeople desperately trying to hold their ground, the bodies of the fallen scattered in the dust. Elena raised her rifle and took careful aim. This shot had to count. She drew in a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet took Dutch Hartwell in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. For a moment, the surviving gang members froze, uncertain and leaderless. That moment was all Kane needed. "Now!" he roared, and the townspeople rose from their positions, charging forward with everything they had. The battle was brief, but savage. Caught between Elena's position and the main force, the remaining gang members fought with the desperation of cornered animals. When the gun smoke finally cleared, 6 of the 8 gang members lay dead in the street. The other 2 had fled into the desert, probably never to be seen again. Dutch Hartwell lay on his back in the dust, his expensive clothes torn and bloody, his breathing labored. Kane knelt beside him, his pistol trained on the outlaw's chest. "You've got about 10 minutes before you bleed out," Kane said quietly. "Where's the money from Millerville?" Dutch's laugh was a wet, painful sound. "Saddlebags. On my horse." "Not that. It'll do you much good." Kane looked up at Elena, who had emerged from behind the church. "Check the horse." Elena found the saddlebags and opened them, revealing more money than she'd ever seen in one place. "It's all here," she called out. Dutch's eyes found Elena's face. "You're the girl, the thief everyone's talking about." "Former thief," Elena corrected. "Now I'm a deputy." Dutch's smile was genuinely amused. "Redemption Creek, aptly named, it seems." His eyes grew distant. "Funny how things work out. I spent my whole life taking things. You spent yours protecting them." "Why?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the question. "Why did you choose this life?" Dutch was quiet for a long moment. "Same reason you chose yours, probably. Seemed like the only option at the time." He coughed and blood flecked his lips. "Difference is, you found something worth fighting for." He died with the setting sun painting his face in shades of red and gold. As the townspeople began to tend to their wounded and count their dead, Elena stood beside Kane in the middle of Main Street. The cost had been high. 3 good men dead, several more wounded, but they had held, they had fought, and they had won. "How do you feel?" Kane asked quietly. Elena looked around at the town she'd helped defend, at the people who'd fought beside her, at the badge on her chest that no longer felt like a costume. "Like I'm finally home," she said. Kane smiled. "Good, because something tells me this is just the beginning." As if to prove his point, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. But this time, Elena didn't tense. This time she knew it was the territorial marshals, arriving too late to help but in time to witness what the people of Redemption Creek had accomplished on their own. The girl who'd stolen bread to survive was gone forever. In her place stood Deputy Elena Vasquez, protector of the peace, defender of the innocent, and living proof that sometimes the most unlikely people can become exactly what a town needs. The real test hadn't been surviving the gang's attack. It had been choosing to stand and fight instead of running away. And in that choice, Elena had found not just